MS1 Block 2 Unit 7 Decision Making Techniques and Processes. 7.1 Introduction. In this unit, various techniques involved in decision making, example brainstorming, semantics, and nominal grouping, are described and discussed. Then the unit describes various methods of identification, selection of various alternatives, and implementation of decisions made. Difference and similarities between individual versus group decision making are then explained, including the phenomenon of groupthink. Various barriers to effective decision making are finally enumerated. 7.2 Techniques used in different steps of decision making. In the model of decision making, you must have observed that any semantics approach to decision making starts with a proper definition of a problem. You will often experience that a problem well defined is a problem half solved because the proper definition helped you to search at relevant place for promising alternatives. You would also agree that a fair approach to decision making demands that parameters for judging alternatives, which are sometimes referred to as criteria, level of aspiration, decision rules, etc., should be explicitly developed before the alternatives are generated and not after. This imperative minimizes the chances of unnecessary compromise, which is the hallmark of a low quality decision. However, once you have developed the criteria, keep them aside and forget about them at the time of the generation of the alternatives. This dissociation of criteria from the alternative generation phase will improve your chance of coming up with a reasonably sufficient number of alternatives. You will understand the importance of generating a reasonable number of alternatives by the simple realization that the quality of a decision can be no better than the quality of the alternatives that you identify. Identification of alternatives. Generation of a reasonable number of goods alternatives is usually no problem. Occasionally, however, developing a variety of good alternatives can be complex matter requiring creativity, thought, and study. These three means for generating alternative are particularly well known. These are brainstorming, synaptics, and nominal grouping. Brainstorming, developed by Alex F. Osborne, brainstorming is the oldest and best known technique for stimulating creative thinking. It involves the use of a group whose members is presented with a problem and is asked to develop as many potential solutions as possible. Members of the group may all be employees of the same firm or outside experts in a particular field. Brainstorming is based on the premise that when people interact in a free and uninhibited atmosphere, they will generate creative ideas. That is, as one person generates an idea, it serves to stimulate the thinking of others. This interchange of ideas is supposedly contagious and creates an atmosphere of free decisions and spontaneous thinking. The objective is to produce as many ideas as possible in keeping with the belief that the larger the number of ideas produced, the greater the probability of identifying an acceptable solutions. Brainstorming is governed by four important rules. First, criticism is prohibited. Judgment of idea must be withheld until all ideas have been generated. It is believed that criticism inhibits the free flow of ideas and group activity. Second, Freewheeling is welcome. The wilder the idea, the better. It is easier to tame down than to think up ideas. Third, quality is wanted. The greater the number of ideas, the greater the likelihood of an outstanding solutions. Third, quantity is wanted. The greater the number of ideas, the greater the likelihood of an outstanding solutions. Fourth, combination and improvement are sought. In addition to contributing ideas of their own, group members suggest how ideas of others can be improved or how two or more ideas can be combined into still another idea. Brainstorming session usually involve 6 to 8 participants and run from 30 minutes to an hour. A 1 hour session is likely to produce anywhere from 50 to 150 ideas. Typically, most ideas will be impractical, but a few will merit serious consideration. Brainstorming has given encouraging results in the field of advertising in all branches of the armed forces and in various central, state, and local agencies. Brainstorming, however, is not without limitations. It is usually most effective when a problem is simple and specific. In addition, brainstorming sessions are time consuming and therefore can be costly. Finally, brainstorming often produced superficial solutions. This latter limitation, of course, can be overcome by selecting group members who are familiar with at least one aspect of the problem being considered. Synectics, developed by William J. Gordon. Synectics is a more recent and formalized creativity technique for the generation of alternative solutions. The term synectics is derived from a Greek word meaning the fitting together of diverse elements. The basic intent of synectics is to stimulate novel and even bizarre alternatives. Through the joining together of distinct and apparently irrelevant ideas, members of a synectics group are typically selected to present a variety of backgrounds and training. An experienced group leader plays a vital role in this approach. The leader states a problem of the group to consider. The group reacts by starting the problem as they understand it. Only after the nature of the problem is thoroughly reviewed and analyzed does the group proceed to offer potential solutions. It is the task of the leader to structure the problem and lead the ensuing discussion in such a manner as to force group members to deviate from their traditional way of thinking. Various methods are employed to invoke the preconscious mind. These may include role playing, the use of analogies, paradoxes, metaphors, and other thought provoking exercises. The intended purpose is to induce fantasies and novel ideas that will modify existing thought patterns in order to stimulate creative alternatives. It is from his complex set of interactions that a final solutions hopefully emerges. A technical expert is ordinarily present to assist the group in evaluating the feasibility of their ideas. Thus, in contrast to brainstorming, where the judgment of ideas is withheld until all ideas have been generated, judicial evaluation of members' suggestions do take place from time to time. In general, available evidence suggests that synaptics has been less widely used than brainstorming. While it suffers from some limitations as brainstorming, it can be time consuming and costly. Its sophisticated manner makes it much more appropriate for complex and technical problems. Nominal grouping, developed by Andre Delbecq and Andre van de Van. Nominal grouping differs from both brainstorming and synaptics in two important ways. Nominal grouping does not rely on free association of ideas and it purposely attempts to reduce verbal interactions. From this latter characteristics, a nominal group derives its names. It is a group in name only. Nominal grouping has been found to be particularly effective in situations requiring a high degree of innovation and idea generation. It generally follows a highly structured procedure involving the following stages. Stage 1: 7 to 10 individuals with different backgrounds and training are brought together and familiarized with the selected problems, such as what alternatives are available for achieving a set of objectives. Stage 2: each group member is asked to prepare a list of ideas in response to the identified problems, working silently and alone. Stage 3: after a period of 10 to 15 minutes, group members share their ideas one at a time in a round robin manner. A group facilitator records the ideas on a blackboard or flip chart for all to see. The round robin process continues until all the ideas are presented and recorded. Stage 4: a period of structured interactions follows in which group members openly discuss and evaluate each recorded idea. At this point, idea may be rewarded, combined, deleted or added. Stage 5: each group members votes by privately ranking the presented idea in order to their perceived importance. Following a brief discussion of the vote, a final secret ballot is conducted. The group's preference is the arithmetical outcome of the individual votes. This concludes the meeting. Nominal grouping has been used successfully in a wide variety of organizations. Its principal benefits is that it minimizes the inhibiting effects of group interactions in the initial generation of alternative solutions. In this sense, the search process is proactive rather than reactive. That is, group members must generate their own original ideas rather than hitchhike on the ideas of others. Additionally, the use of a round robin recording procedure allows risk inclining group members to state risky solutions early, making it easier to less secure participants to engage in similar disclosure. Nominal grouping, however, also has limitations like brainstorming and synaptics. It can be time consuming and therefore costly. Creative thinking. There are many ways of searching for information and alternatives in problem solving. Effective manners use all of their capacities, analytic and creative, conscious and subconscious, and seek both individual and group involvement in this stage of decision making process. As you have seen, the basic requirement at the stage of identification of alternatives is to become more creative. Creativity involves novel combination of ideas which must have theoretical or social values or make an emotional impact on other people. Like the decision making process itself, the creative process also has three stages as shown in following exhibit. Stages in the creative process. Stage preparation type conscious behavior is saturation, investing the problem in all directions to become fully familiar with it, its setting, causes, and effects. Deliberation, mulling over these ideas, analyzing and challenging them, viewing them from different optics. Stage latent period type unconscious behavior is incubation, relaxing, switching off, and turning the problem over to the unconscious mind. Illumination, emerging with possible answers, dramatic, perhaps offbeat, but fresh and new. Stage presentation, type, conscious behaviors is verification, clarifying and fleshing out the idea, testing it against the criterion of appropriateness, accommodation, trying the solution out on other people and other problems. Evaluation of alternatives. Evaluation of various identified possible courses of action constitutes the second step of decision making. Having identified a reasonable number of alternatives as a manager, you should now be in a position to judge the different courses of action which have been isolated. Each alternative must be evaluated in terms of its strength and weakness, benefits and costs, advantages and disadvantages in achieving organizational goals. Since there are usually both positive and negative aspects of every alternative, most evaluations involve a balancing or trade off anticipated consequences. Needless to say, such assessments should be as objective as possible. Evaluation of the relative merit of various alternatives may be performed by a single manager or by a group. An evaluation may be completely intuitive or it may be scientific, using analytical tools and procedures associated with what is known as operations research. More than likely, it will employ a combination of both approaches. Whatever the basis of evaluation, the more systematic the assessment, the more likely it is that the resulting judgment will be accurate and complete. You will know more about different OR techniques like payoff matrix, decision trees, queuing theory, linear programming, simulations, etc. in a separate unit which will help you in your task of evaluation of alternatives. Selection of an alternatives. Once appropriate alternatives has been identified and evaluated, you must select the one alternative with the greatest perceived probability of meeting organizational objectives. Of course, it is entirely possible that the decision maker may be made to go back and identify other alternatives if none are judged to be acceptable. Theoretically, if the identification and evaluation of alternatives has been properly handled, making a choice should be an easy matter. The most desirable alternative will be obvious. In practice, however, selection of a course of action is often the result of a compromise. Enterprise objectives are multiple. As a consequence, choice of an alternative must be made in light of multiple and often conflicting objectives. Indeed, the quality of a decision may often have to be balanced against its acceptability. Resource constraints and political considerations are examples of confounding factors which must be carefully weighed. At this point, sound judgment and experience play important roles. Implementation of decision. Once a plan course of action has been selected, appropriate action must be taken to assure that it is implemented. Implementation is crucial to success of an enterprise. Indeed, it is considered by some to be the key to effective planning. The best plans in the world are absolutely worthless if they cannot be implemented. The activities necessary to put plans into operation must be skillfully initiated. In this respect, no plan is better than the action taken to make it is a reality. With selection of a course of action, you must make detailed provisions for its execution. You must communicate the chosen course of action, gather support for it, and assign resources to see that it is carried out. Development of a sound means of implementation is every bit as important as the decision as to which course of action to pursue. All too often, even the best plan fails as a result of being improperly implemented. 7.3 Individual versus Group Decision Making. You are perhaps aware that in recent times, most of the decisions in any large organization are usually taken by a group of people, example board of directors, committees, task force, etc., rather than by a single individual manager, however brilliant, bright, or powerful the manager may be. Perhaps from your own experience, you are also aware of some of the obvious advantages and disadvantages of group decision making, like the one given below. Let's consider about advantages and disadvantages of group decision making. Advantage is groups can be accumulated more knowledge and facts. Disadvantages group often work more slowly than individuals. Advantage is groups have a broader perspective and consider more alternative solutions. Disadvantages is group decision involves considerable compromises which may lead to less than optimal decision. Advantages is individuals who participates in decision are more satisfied with the decisions and are more likely to support it. For groups are often dominated by one individual or a small clique, thereby negating many of the virtues of group procedures. Advantages is group decision processes serve an important communication functions as well as a powerful political functions. Disadvantages is over reliance on group decision making can inhibit managers' ability to act quickly and decisively when necessary. Looking at this kind of a balance sheet on group decision making, you may well ask whether on the whole, groups are superior to individuals as far as the decision making effectiveness is concerned. It is not possible to give a categorical answers without reference to the nature of the people, the nature of the group, and the context in which the group is making a decision. However, what we know about the impact of the groups in decision making process has been summarized by Harrison 1975 in the following ways. In establishing objectives, groups are typically superior to individuals in that they possess greater cumulative knowledge to bring to bear on problems. Next, in identifying alternatives, individual efforts are important to ensure that different and perhaps unique solutions are identified from various functions ideas that latter can be considered by the group. Next is in evaluating alternatives. Group judgment is often superior to individual judgment because it brings into play a wider range of viewpoints. Next is in choosing an alternatives involving group members often leads to greater acceptance of the final outcome. Next is in implementing the choice, individual responsibility is generally superior to group responsibility regardless of whether decisions are made individually or collectively. Individuals perform better in carrying out the decision than groups do. As you can well see, groups do have some edge over individuals in certain stages of the decision making process. For this reason, you have to decide to what extent you should involve others, particularly your subordinates in the work group, to participate in decision affecting their job. In fact, you have to take a position on the continuum of degrees of participation in decision making. Based on a series of studies on managerial decision making behavior, Room and Yeton 1973 found evidence in support of the following propositions. Managers tend to following propositions. These are managers tend to be more participative when the quality of the decision is important. Next is managers tend to be more participative when subordinate acceptance of the decision is critical for its effective implementation. Next is managers tend to be more participative when they trust their subordinates to focus on organizational rather than personal goal and when conflict among subordinates is minimal. Next is managers tend to be less participative when they have all the necessary information to make a high quality decision. Next is managers tends to be less participative when the immediate problem is well structured or where there is a common solution that has been applied in similar situations in the past. Next is management tend to be less participative when time is limited and immediate action is required. At this juncture, it will be useful for you to be aware of two phenomena which have been observed in group decision making situations. Technically, these two phenomena, which are sometimes experienced in group decision situations, are referred to as risky shift phenomenon and groupthink. First, risky shift phenomenon. Contrary to the popular belief that groups are usually more conservative than individuals, there is abundant evidence to support the propositions that groups make riskier decisions than individuals do. There are four possible reasons. First, risk takers are persuasive in getting more cautious companies to shift their positions. Second, as member of a group familiarize themselves with the issue and arguments, they seem to feel more confident about taking risks. Third, the responsibility for decision making can be diffused across members of the group. Fourth, there is the suggestions that is our culture people do not like to appear cautious in a public context. Second, groupthink, closely related to the risky shift but more serious, is the phenomenon known as groupthink. This phenomenon, first discussed by Zanis 1971, refers to a mode of thinking in a group in which the seeking of concurrence among members becomes so dominant that it overrides any realistic appraisal of alternative course of action. The concept emerged from Zionist studies of high-level policies decisions by government and business leaders. By analyzing the decision process leading up to each action, Janis found numerous indications pointing to the development of group norms that involved moral at the expense of critical thinking. One of the most common norms was the tendency to remain loyal to the group by continuing to adhere to policies and decisions to which the group was already committed, even when the decisions proved to be in error. Outcomes of groupthink. Groupthink can have several deleterious consequences on the quality of decision making. First, groups often limit their search for possible solutions to problems to one or two alternatives and avoid the comprehensive analysis of all possible alternatives. Second, groups often fail to re examine their chosen course of action after new information or events suggest a change in course. Third, group members spend very little time considering whether there are any non-obvious advantages to alternative course of action compared to the chosen course of action. Fourth, groups often make little or no attempt to seek out the advice of experts either inside or outside their own organization, Fifth, members show positive interest in fact that support their preferred decision alternative and either ignore or show negative interest in fact that fail to support it. Finally, groups often ignore any consideration of possible roadblocks to their chosen decision and as a result fail to develop contingency plans for potential setbacks. 7.4 Overcoming barriers to effective decision making. You have just examined different outcomes of a faculty group decision process under the phenomenon called groupthink. In fact, these faults are not exclusive to group decisions only, but you will appreciate that in the early stages of any decision process, there is the likelihood that a variety of perceptual bias by interfere with problems analysis or the identification of possible solutions. Ilbing 1978 has identified several roadblocks that can impede managerial effectiveness in arriving at the most suitable decision. First is the tendency to evaluate before one investigates. Early evaluation precludes inquiry into a fuller understanding of the situations. Next, the tendency to equate new and old exercises. This often causes managers to look for what is similar rather than what is unique in a new problem. Next is the tendency to use available solutions rather than consider new or innovative ones. Next is the tendency to deal with problems at face value rather than ask questions that might illuminate reason behind the more obvious aspects of the problem. Next is the tendency to direct decision towards a single goal. Most problems involve multiple goals that must be handled simultaneously. Next is the tendency to confuse symptoms and problems. Next is the tendency to overlook unsolvable problems and instead concentrate on simpler concerns. Next is the tendency to respond automatically or to act before thinking. Problems like this often cause managers to act in haste before the facts are known and often before the actual underlying problem is recognized or understood. Knowledge of these roadblocks will assist you in your attempts to analyze problems, situations, and make decisions. In case you are a member or leader of any decisions making group, you would like to overcome the emergence of a groupthink mentality in groups and organizations. Taking your cue from Zenith, you can now formulate several strategies to overcome the barriers. First point is group leaders can encourage each member to be a critical evaluator of various proposals. Next point is when groups are given a problem to solve, leaders can refrain from starting their own positions and instead encourage open inquiry and impartial probing of a wide range of alternatives. Next point is the organizations can give the same problem to two different independent groups and compare the resulting solutions. Next point is before the group reaches a final decision, members can be required to take a respite at intervals and seek advice from other wings of the organization before returning to make a decision. Next point is outside expert can be invited to group meeting and encouraged to challenge the views of group members. Next point is at every group meeting, one member could be appointed as a devil's advocate to challenge the testimony of those advocating the majority position. Next point is when considering the feasibility and effectiveness of various alternatives, divide the group into two sections for independent discussion and compare results. Next point is after deciding on a preliminary consensus on the first choice for a course of action. Schedule a second meeting during which members of a group express their residual doubts and rethink the entire issue prior to finalizing the decision and initiating actions. In other words, if groups are aware of the problems of groupthink, several specific and relatively simple steps can be taken to minimize the likelihood of falling victims into this problem. As you already know, recognizing the problem represents half the battle in the effort to make a more effective decision in organizational settings. 7.5 Summary. Many analytical techniques under management science are available to help you take decisions, but when your problems are of the non programmed variety, it is not sufficient to be alert and analytical. You have to use your creative thinking in identifying viable alternatives, judgment, and discretion in evaluating and making a choice. We have also brought the issue of group discussion to your attention as you often make decisions as a group member of a group. You have observed certain inherent advantages of group decision situations. At the same time, we have drawn your attention to some phenomena like risky shift or groupthink, which might emerge in the group process and affect the quality of your decisions. Since you have also reckoned the unusual barriers to effective decisions making and have noted some strategies to overcome them, we are sure this unit will sharpen your skills of decision making as a manager. Thank you.